first thing I want to talk about is just kind of some of the parts, and the first thing you should do. The very first thing that we're going to work on is the center section. And so what I've done here is I have sliced off the top of the beds. You might want to use those later. Right now we just need the bottoms. And then I've used some hot glue to stick them together, just making sure that they're down flat. I also lined up this straight line at the back that kind of is a nice common straight edge in the back. Now, an important thing about hot glue is you want to make sure that you're using low temp hot glue on this rigid insulation. The high setting will actually melt it out. And while we're talking about glues, the glues that I'm going to use for this build are going to be low temp hot glue and Gorilla Glue for anything that's touching the foam. And then there's some wood pieces, and so I'm going to be using, I use some just, wood glue to glue these doublers together. And then as far as attaching wood to carbon fiber, I'm using some just rubberized glue, E6000, Goop, any of those, but this type of stuff should never touch this foam. And if you have some other type of glue, I would use some of the extra pieces and try it first. Even spray adhesive, you got to be careful. It will eat through this stuff quick, so just test it first. So one of the things you're going to want to have prepared before we start working on the first part, which is the center section, is you're going to want the tail section, the vertical stabilizers, all glued up. And you're going to want the ballast tube sanded. Now, with the vertical stabilizer, all I did was I cleaned up just from some of the laser, and then I rounded the leading edge, and then I actually kind of came to kind of a point at the back. This is going to be taking some hard hits. It's going to get covered, so that's going to help a little bit, but don't make it too thin. This is, a basher slope plane. It's going to be hitting the bushes and stuff. As far as how I attached the carbon tube, I wrapped some sandpaper around this and then just kind of, ground a nice little round spot into the bottom of here, gooped it on, and then about a quarter of an inch up, I wrapped the E6000 around, and that makes, it's on there, it's super tight. And then the same thing with this little doubler piece, it's just E6000 on. And to make sure that this is perpendicular, I actually took a couple things. You could use cans of paint, anything. I just pinched it between there, push that down. That's going to make everything perpendicular 90 to itself. So this is the actual tail. Now the part that this goes into is the other part. Same thing, there's a couple pieces of wood, you double them up, glue to the carbon. After sanding this, of course, sand all your stuff before you apply glue. The idea with these two parts is they slide together into the back of the wing, and then you'll have some little screws, like servo screws, that will keep that in place, and that will also keep it from twisting in flight. Now, these pieces, they don't perfectly match up. I found that it's a real pain to find two interlocking tubes. It's much easier to find one that's slightly smaller. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll wrap a little bit of tape here and a little bit of tape here just to inch up, on that size. We just don't want it to have a lot of wiggle room. We want it to have some pressure in there. So get these things made up, get this sanded. You're also going to want a spray bottle on hand if you're using Gorilla Glue. Again, I'm making this video for people that haven't used these construction techniques before. Those of you that have used these know what you're doing, so you can just continue on. So here are the two center sections. I've already started tracing some things out. Now this piece obviously is going to go right at CG, and as you can see there's an access hole right there. So these will get slid in, and so when we glue these two pieces together, this also has to be glued in. So there's going to be a little bit of making sure we do the right steps to get everything glued in properly. You can also see that I have traced some things out here. This was a little access door cover, I guess. This will be permanently glued in place. I like this because what it allows you to do, so normally when you have holes in this type of foam and the covering comes up to that edge, and even though you're going to iron it down, it's still over time of lifting up the lid starts to peel that off. So something like this allows you to smear hot glue all around this, and then when you come back with the iron, you cover over this, and when you come over with the iron, it just really sticks down and makes it a lot harder for that to start coming up. And then this is just a little door. So this will be flush mounted into the foam. I'm thinking after we get this all glued together, I'll do that. As far as what I like to use a rotary tool. In this case, it's just a Wen, but I actually have a Dremel depth attachment that lets me make some, very specific depth cuts. An old soldering iron works just as well too, or just hogging it out. As far as this hatch, I'm not quite sure yet. I'll probably make a Goop or E6000 hinge so that it goes up like that, and then I'll probably just go simple and just tape it down in flight, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now let's focus on what this little thing I have here. This piece is going to be in the foam right there. So what that means is we need to dig out half the thickness of this in this side, take out that whole chunk there so that this piece sits in like that. I'm going to glue that ahead of time so that we don't have it moving around when we glue these two pieces together. Also, if you think about how this is going to work, this piece has to slide up in to that spot, which means that this foam back here has to be removed. So what I've done is I've marked 14, so I went about 7 millimeters back and 14 millimeters over, and that's this whole section we're just going to remove with the razor blade. Now right here on the bottom and the top, those are places where the fiberglass 2 millimeter rods are going to be going across, and so you want to get it in the middle so that the rods actually capture the carbon fiber tube when we get to that step. So don't go too far one way or the other, and don't worry too much about this angle. It's a vertical stabilizer, it's not a horizontal stabilizer. It'll be just fine. A couple other things we need to be thinking about right now too before we glue this together. This is another spot just like this for fiberglass. This spot here, it's thin and tall, and that is to bring the servo wires in from the outer wing up to where we're going to store the electronics. And I've marked two possible locations. Obviously, this plane is going to be pretty tail heavy, and you're going to add probably a couple hundred grams of nose weight. If you're using a lighter battery, like 1,000 to 2,000 milliamp NIM, like AA battery, which is kind of a standard slope pack, I actually like using LIFE, the life packs. They're very light. I might put my electronics back here and leave all of this. After we're all done covering, I'm going to remove the covering down here, hog out the foam, fill it with lead. But if you have a really heavy battery, maybe you're putting in like a 3 or 4S or some heavy battery with a BEC to get it down to 5 volts, you might want to put all that weight more towards the forward, and then you won't need as much lead. But the reason I'm pointing it out now is that the servo extension slot is in front of these two fiberglass rods. It's going to be kind of a pain later to dig a hole back to this spot. So if you know right now, I'm putting my receiver and battery here, we want to drop in that servo extension, make it flush in the foam, hog some of this out and just stuff it in there. So just something to think about before we glue this together. Okay. Now, as you can see, there's this slit across here. What we're going to do is we're going to get this almost all the way in. And the idea is you want a good hand grip right here. We're going to glue the two pieces together, and then we're going to drop glue all down in this slit, not into the inside. We really want to stay away from the inside of the ballast tube. And then across here, we're going to spray water. And then because we have that hand grip, we're going to spin this and really work that Gorilla Glue all into that. And then we're going to rotate it till that is facing up. We're going to then slide it in all the rest of the way. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that even once you get it all the way in, it doesn't go all the way to the foam, and that's actually on purpose. I have these little pieces here. Before we put it in there, this will get glued onto there about as close to center as you can. I made a hole so you can kind of see it. This piece here fits inside of the ballast tube, and this piece here covers the outside of the ballast tube, and they create caps. So when you do drop ballast in there, there's going to be a little bit of room when you are banking where they can slide around. We want to just minimize that a little bit. And you can think too of every time you turn, this is like hitting the foam and hitting the foam and hitting the foam, and eventually it's just going to destroy that foam. I mean, I guess it could work its way out, but it's just going to not be good. So instead, this here will give it a flat surface. This will be glued with probably E6000 to the copper. It'll also be up against the foam. So this just gives it a nice place to hit. Now, speaking of the ballast, depending on what you use to cut these is going to change how much free space you have in there. I include this spacer, and this will give you 11. Now that odd number 11 is very important. You want an odd number so that if you had an even number, when you looked in the hatch, you'd have this, and it'd be very hard to get one of those out by flipping it wouldn't just fall out if you flipped the wing over. By having an odd number, you have one right in the middle, and you can flip your plane over and get that out. And then once that's out, it's really easy to get the rest out. Now, this here is compensating for the kerf, K-E-R-F. That's the thickness of the blade of like a chop saw. But unless you're really comfortable using a chop saw, I actually would recommend using a bandsaw. A bandsaw is much less dangerous. Let me show you. This is what happens when a chop saw gets away from you, and it like hit my thumb and it hurt for like a couple days. And once you get to the very last piece, there's nothing to grip on. It's just kind of sketchy. So I'd recommend a bandsaw to cut these up. Now a bandsaw is much thinner. Yeah, maybe like 1 millimeter or less, whereas a chop saw is like 3 millimeters. So what I mean basically is that once you get these all cut up, before you put the copper in, put them in there and see how much wiggle room there is. And what you might need to do is just take something else and just build this up right here, just so that the pieces don't slide around a lot.